Control is an experience best had firsthand. I'm going to make this as spoiler-free as possible, keeping footage and specific discourse to the first few hours, but in my opinion, everything in this game is a spoiler. I went in knowing genuinely nothing, and I feel like that's by far the best way to experience Control. I, a random person with an annoying voice on YouTube, hereby endorse this game. Maybe leave and go play Control. Thanks. I adore a good rainy street in a game, and Control just might take the shiny pavement cake. In the opening moments of the game, you wouldn't be blamed for seeing the intentionally weird, slightly difficult to follow narrative as being off-putting and pretentious. But what starts off as seeming kinda silly quickly becomes terrifying. This building, its immediate lack of obvious occupation, these paintings, and more monolithic corporate-looking aspects of this world are just deeply unsettling. It's not easy for a non-horror game to make you afraid of doors. Upon a second playthrough, I assure you, everything that was at first confusing not only makes sense, it's genius. The writing in this game is outstanding, and I don't know that I've ever seen dark science fantasy done better. I say science fantasy and not science fiction because so much of what happens in the game, no matter how well explained it is not meant to be seen as possible. Graphics are beautiful sometimes and pretty flaky other times, at least on the base PS4. It's still very pretty and a visual delight. I mean, what this game does with lighting and color is what God of War does with axe catching. Alright, that's a terrible analogy, but I cannot overstate how absolutely impeccable the art direction is. This game is a spectacle. Without spoiling what happens, the ashtray maze had my jaw on the floor the entire time. This game has some shockingly great moments, visually and generally.
So, welcome. Assuming you have the necessary clearance, and do follow the safety protocols. Read the manual. Otherwise, bad things will happen.
Things took a long time to render, and I hit huge frame rate drops and decently long-lasting lag, especially when going in and out of menus. Along that same line, loading screens are horrendous. I died very, very frequently, so I spent an enormous amount of time waiting to load back in and get a chance to be killed in 2 hits by a basic enemy. What the AI can do to you is just comical. Some enemies take damage like bullet sponges and again, can literally kill you within 2 attacks. Enemies are often very fast and can evade damage far better than the player character. You feel tremendously weaker than even the most basic enemies once you start seeing level 6s. The narrative being so gripping and compelling was at a certain point the only thing that kept me slogging through. You can also fall off any ledge and just die, which I'm assuming you will, often. Speaking of things you're going to do often in Control, you're going to get lost. The map is a great map. You have fast travel at every save point, but you will still absolutely get confused, turned around, and lose time backtracking. Full disclosure here, after having beaten the game and witnessed its full glory, I have gone back to an extremely positive opinion on the game as a whole. I loved most of my time spent in the oldest house, but sometimes I truly hated it. Mission 9, for example, is not just a difficulty spike, it is a difficulty wall that makes few of the secret bosses in the game seem as easily destroyed as my sanity. This is a game that fucks with you. I would go as far as to say it hurls ex-girlfriend-like levels of psychological warfare your way. And I mean that as the highest of compliments. The level design and way things shift and change, the way they often subvert expectations in creative outside-the-box ways are all masterfully done. And I found the narration to be oddly comforting. I enjoyed feeling like the protagonist is talking to me personally while I play. It doesn't hurt that Jesse is a great, very likable character whose mental illness is conveyed incredibly well, both by the choppy cutscenes, the occasional brief cuts to live action, and in her ever-present inner monologue. For a game called Control, she certainly seems to be out of it sometimes. She doesn't seem to know why she's doing what she's doing. You kinda just go from place to place as you're told, like you do in every video game, but here it seems much more intentional than ever. She's a very relatable character, especially from the mental illness fighting the inner you perspective. Also, amazing voice acting and actual acting by the entire cast is notable. But our protagonist is the real highlight for me. Courtney Hope absolutely kills it. I would describe this game as a psychological thriller first with third-person shooter elements, as opposed to a shooter with brain scrambles thrown in. The gunplay does feel good though, seems pretty accurate, and combat as a whole is very well done. That being said, I use launch probably equally as often as the service weapon. All the powers and abilities are massively incorporated into gameplay. Environments are remarkably destructible. I was often surprised by what I could smash through with the melee button, and I thoroughly enjoyed shooting enemies through glass of a sterile-looking corporate meeting room. Combine that destructibility, the well-tuned third-person trigger pulling, and the ability to hurl debris at your foes, and you have some really fun, great gameplay. I did like the combat, the level design, and the writing, but the thing I'll remember the most about my experience is definitely the style and art direction. Those text graphics that announce a new location are awesome, and they make my text graphics look like shit. Along that same line, these little Casper Darling videos explaining various objects of power, events, and locations in the game are so good it causes me a small amount of physical pain.
Now, The service weapon is, of course, a prime example of an OOP, a very powerful one. Ingrained in the Bureau's DNA, a key component in our prime candidate program. Come out of that Russian roulette a winner, and you're it. Lose, and you're, well, fired. Thank you. I'm Dr. Darling, Head of Research, Federal Bureau of Control.
They're done with the sarcasm and humor I would expect to find in Fallout or Portal. There isn't a lot of hand-holding, but it is one of the best curated experiences I've had in a game. A lot of the narrative is in the form of found footage, inter-office memos, and environmental clues. There is a linear story, crafted very, very well. I wouldn't say it's on rails necessarily, as you do have a lot of freedom to explore, but it's sort of like a ride in an amusement park. Only it's the scary one from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. As a whole, I loved this game. It was a real trip to see Jessie go from entering this building so confused and reluctant to being, well, what she winds up being. She's a scared new girl on the block, and you can really feel her panic while frantically searching these cold labyrinthian halls. As you go through the game though, she evolves into a different character. She's confident, she looks like she really belongs where she is, though she doesn't really seem to get cured of her mental illness as time goes on. She just slowly incorporates that aspect of herself better and better, despite her battle against the frequency of evil. It felt to me like that was the point of this experience, and it's one that translates to real life as well. It was easy to relate to Jessie Faden, to walk through the game in her supernaturally elevated shoes. You start off just as confused and fumbling as she does. Together, the two of you try to fight against an all-consuming evil. You explore, struggle, and grow together. By the end of the game, without even noticing it, just by taking things seriously, by deciding to be in charge and to take on responsibility for this problem, even though it isn't your fault, you establish some form of, well, control. Yes, if you watch this whole thing, first of all, bless your soul. Secondly, please consider leaving a comment about your favorite parts of Control. Maybe even press the more positive of the two judgment buttons. Thanks.
Some brains can talk to each other. We call this ESP.